that we'll be using will primarily be English, but the language is open. Kalau nak respond dalam bahasa Melayu nanti boleh, kalau nak bagi soalan dalam bahasa Melayu boleh. Either language, English or Malay will be completely fine. We're looking forward to your questions. The questions will be in the last half an hour of the session. The first half an hour will be the panel discussion first.
Okay, we're going live in a minute. Yeah, I think we're live. Yes, we're live now. Okay, Nadine, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this DMM dialogue session. So welcome to the DMM dialogue session, specifically on prison reform in Malaysia. Allow me to introduce myself. I am Nadine Faisal, one of the DMM representatives, specifically for Tenggara. Joining me are three esteemed panelists. Let me introduce them quickly. So first, not necessarily in order, but first we have with us YB Liew Tong. He is currently the DAP Central Executive Committee member, Deputy Secretary General, and leader of the opposition in the Johor State Assembly. He received his degree in political science and honors degree in Asian Studies from the Australia National University and international masters in regional integration, Asia-Europe Institute from the University of Malaya. Besides being in the political field, YB Liew Tong is active in research studies where he has published books in both English and Malay, as well as contributing to journals. His research fields include defense and security and institutional reform. Umavathni is the Collective Operating Officer at Collective of Applied Law and Legal Realism. She completed her studies in international relations and human rights. Some of her past working experiences include assisting the works of the representative of Malaysia to the AICHR for the term of 2016 to 2018 and managing cases for survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. She has also previously assisted in writing articles, reports, and research papers and co-authored a baseline research report on reforming prisons and all places of detention commissioned by Suaram. She recently wrote a soon-to-be-published book chapter, congratulations, on strategic lawsuits against public participation and enhancing external grievance mechanisms in the context of business and human rights. Then we also have YB Nurul Izzah Anwar. She is the current member of parliament for Permatang, Pauh, serving her third term. Prior to being MP, she was a strong proponent of political and civil rights, bent on pursuing a holistic reform agenda to expand Malaysia's democratic space. Her current work revolves around projects to empower the most vulnerable segments of her constituency, including Program Rose, Permatang Pauh Women's Project, etc. She is also an active member of the All-Party Parliamentary Group Malaysia for the Reform of All Places of Detention, APPGM, where she continues to reiterate her calls for national prison reform. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I think I'll begin by giving the viewers and participants, both in the Zoom and also through our FB live stream, an overview of our systems of incarceration, including prisons, immigration detention centers, and also our lockups. So Malaysia has 52 prisons, 21 immigration detention centers, and also hundreds of lockups that are actively in use. In terms of capacity, our prisons have a 61,000 person capacity, but reportedly are operating with 70,000 people at the moment. Detention, it's harder to find a credible source, but the official occupancy is somewhere between 13 and 21,000. But according to KDN, as of July 12, there are around 18,000 people currently in the immigration detention centers. However, reports of overcrowding abound, with close to 300 deaths, including 6 children, in the past 18 months alone. So this is definitely a sobering topic, and it's also a very large one. Any of the subtopics could easily fill a lecture. But the past few years have seen prisons featured quite regularly in our headlines, from so-called prison clusters for the COVID-19 pandemic, concerns about police brutality and death in custody, and even the recent prison breaks. For example, in April, there were 6 inmates that escaped Jelebu prison in Negeri Sembilan, and also coincidentally in the same month, we saw over 500 Rohingya detainees escape an immigration detention camp in Kedah, revealing images of families, women, and children, and with multiple of them dying in the attempt. But although it really came to the fore during the pandemic, this has actually been a very, very long conversation. In 1995, for example, Irene Fernandez released a memorandum and was almost sentenced to 11 years to prison for supposedly besmirching the country. Amnesty also released reports regarding conditions in detention in the early 2000s. And unfortunately, the conversation seems to have been stagnant since then, almost 30 years onwards, because earlier this year, not Malaysian less, so perhaps less accountable to the Malaysian government, but by an Indonesian coalition called Koalisi Migran Buruh Berdaulat. They released a report that described detention as hellish, with hundreds of deaths and a lot of instances of humiliation of detainees. So my first question to the panelists, amid concerns that prison conditions have raised in the discourse around prisons in the past 2 years, there has also been a strong showing of the sentiment that prison isn't meant to be comfortable anyway. Prison tu bukannya macam hotel. And the idea that people in prison have presumably been actually convicted of a crime and are presumably a danger to society. So this is a very strong view that comments, but why should we care? In particular care? Perhaps we have to leave soon, unfortunately. We can start with YB Nurul Izzah.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam hormat. Thank you very much, Nadine. Of course, our fellow panelists, YB Tong, Uma. I think what I like to repeat or reiterate as a response to your question, Nadine, which is important because it's the prevailing viewpoint, that you hear from some quarters in the government. Some statements that were made in the past stating that penjara ni bukanlah tempat yang comfortable. Kita nak punish, kita nak make sure they pay for their crimes. And I reiterate the Nelson Mandela rules because it's very important to understand the human rights, hak seorang insan. That's very pivotal in the whole issue revolving incarceration. Now, we know that majority of those behind bars come from the lowest income household group. That's one. So they are partly the victims of a vicious cycle of poverty and usually linked to crime. Now, the Nelson Mandela rules states, among others, that's very important for us to observe these rights. First, prevention from torture. So just because you're in prison doesn't necessitate or basically means that you deserve to be tortured. Number two, the issue of your right to a fair trial, which leads to the very important principle that you assume, the presumption of innocence is paramount. So for people who have money to pay lawyers, perhaps they feel that, my day in court will come, but if you're poor, even access to legal help is close to impossible. So for me, it's very important to reorient this, and I end with Jabatan Penjara Malaysia's own motto, iaitu mereka adalah peneraju khidmat korektif. Maksudnya, they are spearheading correctional services. What does correctional service mean? You know, so if you speak to the ordinary wardens, the even ketua pengarah penjara, he will always say, you tasked us with a difficult and challenging responsibility to rehabilitate former convicts. We want them to be integrated and become human beings that can contribute back to society, right? So it's a tough job. You know, please support us in this endeavor. Therefore, you don't send someone to the gallows. You send them, of course, after they've been proven guilty through a court of law. Tapi, you know, there has to be that right, you know, deserving of a second chance for them to rebuild their lives. And, you know, fun fact, yeah, which I think people who lack empathy should remember, 70%, yeah, of those who were incarcerated before the pandemic will never see their family members again. So during the pandemic, no one sees them. And I think it's very incumbent on us to see this not just from the human rights perspective, but about how we can humanize each other and embrace each other in a world that's constantly being challenged by poverty and other related problems.
Thank you, Nurul, Izzah. Uma?
Thanks so much, Nadine, for the introduction. And I think, honestly, YB Izzah, you already framed this really beautifully. And at least I don't have a really good justification, but why I can tell you I care is at the end of the day, they're all human beings. Whether you're deprived of your liberty or whatnot, you're still a human being. And, you know, for example, if you're talking about someone who is not a Malaysian nationality, we're talking about refugees, asylum seekers, and whatnot. No one wants to leave their country. No one wants to be prosecuted. No one wants to be in such a situation, in dire situation. And, you know, situations like that has forced them to, you know, escape their country and seek asylum elsewhere to live a better life. So for me, I think it all boils down at the end of the day is to the essence of humanity, because at the end of the day, they're all human beings. So yeah.
Thank you, Uma. Tong?
Thank you, Nadine. Good evening to everyone. First of all, I believe that Malaysia deserves better. It sounds cliche, but I think a kinder state, a state that is kinder is actually a state that is good for everyone. Why I say so? During COVID, it was very clear that the early stages of COVID, prison was the main center for COVID infection. If you remember that there was a wave after the Sabah election, that wave started in Lahad Datu and Tawau prisons. And there are multiple examples of that. Of course, all this problem predates COVID, but the point is we could have done much better. And Malaysia was blindly following something called the war on drugs. In 1971, Richard Nixon decided that one of the ways to campaign on law and order in order to win the support of white American is to go on this idea that, in a way, a bit of racial idea that the blacks are causes of crime. So we criminalize drug to the extent that if you are trafficking drugs, you even with small quantity, you will be sent to the gallows. And usage of drugs is also seen as a crime and not a medical condition or not a problem. I mean, not something that has to be treated, but actually a crime. So because of that idea, for the last 40 years, we have been incarcerating many people. And within the prison system, more than 60% of prisoners are actually drug user, not necessarily drugs trafficker, but drug users. So interestingly, the racial idea behind Nixon's war on drugs, when it transplanted to Malaysia, people don't realize that, well, maybe 90% of those on prison prison in the prison are Malays, and policymakers never know that they were copying ideas from the US, and they were copying lousy ideas from the US. So I think Malaysia deserves better, and I hope we can actually change this in the years to come.
Thank you, Chin Tong. I think it's also important to raise the idea that incarceration does not necessarily equal crime. Unfortunately, our flawed system puts many innocent people behind bars due to lack of access to fair trial, lack of access to representation, etc. And even if they did commit a crime, prison is not necessarily the rational response. So
Just to add to what you say, there was one point we were told a figure. On the average day, 20 over 1,000 prisoners out of the 60,000 that you mentioned much earlier are actually remand prisoners. That means they are not convicted of a crime yet.
Yeah. So just because someone is incarcerated doesn't necessarily that isn't like a conclusion on their moral status. All right, so prison reform is a huge topic. Let's give our participants an expert overview because I have the advantage of having all of you here. So going around the room, so to speak, what are the biggest challenges that the Malaysian prison system presents itself or that it faces in Malaysia today? Nurul, Izzah, please, perhaps you can start.
Apologies, the rain might disrupt my voice. I hope you can hear me. I think I wanted to just wonderful report that Uma was also part of, which really sums up the key problems, to the Malaysian prison ecosystem. Not just, of course, limited to Jabatan Penjara, but of course, immigration centers. You're talking about overcrowding, concerns about health and living conditions, some of which still utilize the bucket system, inadequate budget for facilities, because usually the prison department is seen secondary to the police force, right? So the focus is not so much on rehab, it's more on managing or tackling crime, which I admit is important. But both have their own range of crucial intervention to stop or stem the tide. And of course, lack of centralized, available, and accessible data, as well as citizen perception and social reintegration. You know that based on another report by Khazanah Research Institute, it's called Open Prison Data, which they inferred from global sources. It's like going through a very challenging labyrinth just to get data. So one of the key things to solve a particular problem, you need to get hard, reliable data. So I think these are the key items that's going to be the main challenges for us. And I believe one special spark of hope is seen through the Jabatan Penjara Malaysia's own zeal to initiate and implement reforms. But until and unless you get the budget sorted and the strategic steps dealt with, then we will not make much meaningful change.
Thank you, Nurul, Izzah. Chin Tong, perhaps you can continue.
Yeah, thank you. I think I agree with Izzah. I think the most important thing is actually political will. We are unfortunately having this idea that the government has to compete with everyone on law and order, or have to show that our government competence is premised on the basis of upholding law and order, and upholding law and order is to be seen as tough as possible on whoever they think is the enemy of the state. And therefore, there is this inertia and this inability to comprehend that we have to change the way we do things. So Izzah, myself, and Azalea, we organized a meeting with the Speaker of Parliament and the President of Upper House of Senate in December 2020. So Rais Yatim was there, Azhar was there, and we invited Hamza. Through the speakers, we managed to invite Home Minister Hamza to come. And Hamza reiterated what you have just said at the beginning of this forum. He said, oh, prison is not meant to be comfortable. But I mean, we are not talking about comfort. We are talking about prison must ensure that it is not a hotbed of disease. Prison must ensure that dignity of human beings are respected. So this is, I think, the problem of political will. If we can change that, we can change the political ideas. We can change and show that the public is prepared to receive something that is a bit more moderate. Then we can move things. I'll give you an example. Actually, not so much of the prison part, but on Rohingya, Malaysia is regressing. In 2016, December 2016, at that point of time, then Prime Minister Najib and past President Hadi Awang was trying to realign their political affiliation. So they organized a big event in support of the Rohingyas. And from then on, during the Najib period, Malaysia was seen as trying to help the Rohingya, especially after the massacre in August 2017. The armed forces actually sent 56 people to Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh to help the Rohingya refugees. And as Deputy Defense Minister, I visited Cox's Bazar in May 2019. The then and now Foreign Minister Saifuddin Abdullah also visited. Then Defense Minister Masabu also visited. Malaysia was doing so much for the Rohingya, and at every international meeting, I was talking about the Rohingya issues and hoping to contribute on it. But then, when there was a change of government during COVID, with Hamza's leadership, everything goes down the drain. Rohingya became enemy number one. They became our main source of trouble. They became anything that's wrong in the country, they were the culprit. So I think we do need a political consensus or a majority of people recognizing that we need to reform the prison system. We need to reform the way we deal with drugs. We need to reform the way we deal with refugees, and find something in the middle. Thank you.
I see Nurul Izzah wants to respond. So perhaps Nurul Izzah first, then we can go to Uma.
Sorry, Uma, I wanted to add on to Chin Tong's point, Nadine. It's very important to remember history. Sometimes we quickly move to new sentiments which are not really in accordance with moral compass. Malaysia was also home to Bosnian refugees. We just celebrated, we just commemorated the Srebrenica massacre on the 11th of July, if I'm not mistaken, Chin Tong. And it's very important to kind of recall Malaysia was at the front lines of providing home, protection, education to Bosnian refugees who are now not just, they are very successful. They're helming key positions in Islamic Development Bank and elsewhere. Not to mention the background with the boat people incident. So it is really, I feel, partly incumbent on the government untuk mengingatkan tentang sejarah bila ada kesungguhan politik. Maksudnya, of course, it's not going to be easy. We're not going to say assimilation will take place overnight, but we have always been there, providing refuge, and today it could be their turn and their challenge, but one day it could be us. So it is very sad to see that things change as if we didn't have a consistent moral compass that's always showcasing where north is. And right now, I don't think it's even working. Some magnets are pulling it, political magnets are pulling it in different directions. But I wanted to mention, in light of the Srebrenica massacre, that Malaysia was also very pivotal in providing safety. So it's just, kesungguhan politik itu melihat juga kepada sejarah yang telah melibatkan diri kita sebagai antara pemimpin, the leaders in providing refuge to those who are facing challenges in their home countries.
Just before we hear your response, Uma, I think it's already becoming apparent just how intersectional the discussion on reform to systems of incarceration is. So just to give some context to listeners and also viewers, the reason why refugees become part of the discourse is because within the detention centers, a lot of refugees unfortunately also go to detention centers, whether or not they have a UNHCR card. And then the UNHCR has to go through a process in order to get them out. Unfortunately, this is the case. Uma?
Yeah, thanks, Nadine. So I think there are quite a lot of issues that are interlinked here, and there's a lot that we see happening, especially during the COVID, during the pandemic at least. And I'm just going to reiterate some of the points that were highlighted in the report that I co-authored, and also as mentioned by YB Izzah. So before that, I think first of all, the issue is that how our focus has been so much on retributive justice as compared to rehabilitative justice. A lot of the punishment are also not proportionate to the crimes or offenses that are committed. But also, I think in a way we are slowly seeing progress, because in few days back, the Dewan Rakyat actually passed the Offenders Compulsory Attendance Bill 2021, which creates alternative punishments outside of prisons for certain crimes. And this is, for me at least, I see this as a progress to actually reducing the issue on overcrowding. But then again, what we saw quite apparent from reports during the pandemic was the issue of overcrowding actually. And the problem of overcrowding is not something that came up only during the pandemic, but it has happened way before the pandemic, sometime I think in 2018 or 2019. If you see the numbers, it was actually above 65,000. And at that time, the capacity of prisons were nationwide was, I think, also around almost that figure, but it was told that it was reported that prisons were already past the capacity. The second thing is actually on the issue of health living conditions. So if you see during the COVID period, and when you tie it back to the issue of overcrowding, say for example in a cell, right, like that cell could only accommodate 4 people initially. What happens when you try to accommodate double the amount? And especially with the spread of infectious disease, you're putting those people at risk, and not only those persons who are deprived of their liberty, but also the staffs of those facilities. So there's also concerns on right to privacy of those persons deprived of their liberty, and also their right to be treated with dignity. And outside of what happens within the 4 walls of these facilities, there's other issues such as the lack of data, accessible and available data. There's inadequate budget that is placed or prioritized for prisons and also all places of detention. There's also this thing which we rarely talk about, I think, which is stigmatization. A lot of people are stigmatized, have this sort of attitude, a preconceived attitude towards persons who are deprived of their liberty. So how do we tackle that? From the way media has portrayed this group of people, we sort of have a negative connotation towards them. So I think that is one of the other issue that we need to tackle. So basically that's my points.
Thank you so much, Uma. And I'm glad to have heard from everyone. Before we continue, I think I would like to be really careful about what we're aiming for and the logics and assumptions that we might be using. I think already it's been raised in the discussion that prison sentences are not always the best response towards any particular crime. For example, just now, Tong raised the issue of prison as a response to drug offenses. But let's push that a little further. Are prisons or system or the detention centers or the systems of detention and prison altogether, are they really making us safer? And what is the evidence for that? Subsequently, are we actually being too conservative in our aims? Because when you talk about, for example, one of the solutions, so a discussion of solution has already come up in terms of like increasing the budget. Should we really be investing more into the system, or should we be divesting from prison and detention? Because, okay, should we invest more so that it can accommodate the number of people it's accommodating now, or make sure that people don't go into prisons in the first place? So please, your thoughts. I know that YB Nurul Izzah will have to leave very soon, so I'll also let YB Nurul Izzah lead with this one.
Thank you so much, Nadine, and I thank the panelists for being so understanding. Apologies for cutting queue. I think key points here. Let's look at the evidence. Yeah, if you look at the Malaysian context, recidivism, which means the propensity of somebody going back to prison, yeah, for the same offense, repeat offender, is much lower when they go through rehabilitation within the community versus going through prison and undergoing whatever programs that may be in existence. That's clear. So that's why the prison department is very keen. Kalau boleh bagi penjenayah yang tidak ganas, you know, so it's really specific to those who have not committed violent crimes. Yes, you have alternative modes to going to prison. Some other, you know, community correction programs. The mechanism is there in Malaysia, yeah, and the ministry has introduced amendments with law to make it easier. However, the numbers are very little. So the numbers of prisoners that are utilizing this pathway is very small, so you don't have the impact that you want. So we need to reorient that, and that's why criminal justice reform matters. Now, the other part, do more prisons or do more people in prison make a country safer? And I think evidence from the American numbers, you talk about the US, no, because people just keep repeating the offense. 70% recidivism rate in the US, and US has highest prison population per capita in the world. Contrast to Norway, only 20% recidivism rates, yeah? And you know how they manage their prisoners. So they really give a lot of, they look seriously about the human rights aspect of prisoners, and they're accorded with comfort because you're supposed to be deprived of your liberty, not your rights to a nutritious food or even your rights to be educated and so on and so forth, yeah? So this should formulate our understanding as to why more prisons is not the answer. So I think when I look at the announcements made by the minister, my concern is the plan is either to build more prisons, yeah, or perhaps moving on to private prisons. We need more disclosure. We need more engagement. And I hope, you know, myself and Babi Tong through the APPGM, or Party Parliamentary Group on Prison Reform and Reform of Places of Detention, that we can have this kind of open discussion, because at the end of the day, we want Malaysia to be safer together, right? And this is one of the key ways to let the evidence lead the way of policy making. Now, the last bit I want to say, we do need a sentencing council to make this work. I mean, kita cakap macam mana pun, if there's no proper avenue mechanism, which we've been asking for, which the prison department wants, but has yet to be announced by the ministry, then we can't formulate these things. We can't take up the findings from Suaram. We can't effectively implement, yeah? And so anyhow, I think that's one of the key things that we want to look at. And I believe do away with prisons altogether. Now, kena hati-hati. Because if you look at some cities in the US, they were back of Black Lives Matter movement. there were also moves to do away with, imprisoning anyone or, who did. I think the impact was increased crime and a sense, anarchy in some of the findings. So it's important to be measured, to be evidence-based, and to start incrementally whilst being very clear-cut about defending human rights, making sure we abide by the Nelson Mandela rules. But for me, we're dealing with people's lives here. We're dealing with the safety of the country. So you're trying to balance between the two, to make sure that Malaysia emerges as not just a harmonious, but a safe place for everyone, including refugees and people without legitimate documentation to thrive in. Now, with that, thank you very much, everybody. Saya minta maaf sangat-sangat. I have to leave us, but of course, in the able hands of Tong and Uma, I am not worried. But again, thank you to DMM. Thank you, Nadine, for according me the space to share some of our thoughts as we learn through this process. Assalamualaikum.
Walaikum salam. Thank you so much. All right, let's just continue on. Perhaps Uma, you can continue this time.
So I think from my perspective is that I think we need to tackle the root issue of why people commit crimes in the first place. So is it because of inequality? Is it because of a person's social standing, socioeconomic standing? Is it the disparity in income where, there is still a noticeable gap between the rich and poor that we need to address? That is, I think, one of the things that we need, at least Malaysia or the government has to look into. In terms of solutions, obviously we can come up with so many solutions, but like what YB Izzah has mentioned earlier on, there needs to be a sentencing council to sort of be the check and balance of this, of the solutions that would be proposed or that has been raised by civil society, for example. At least for my end, how I see it is that Malaysia should start implementing human rights-based approach in its practices. So when we talk about human rights-based approach, what is it? It's equality, non-discrimination, accountability, participation, empowerment, legality. So these are the things that are essential as to, how we can see progress in terms of prison reforms. When we're also talking about human rights-based approach, there's a need for transparency and accountability. So which is why there is that issue of the lack of available and accessible data. With that being absent, it's very hard for us to also work from the ground to ensure, we can help provide substantive input to the government as to how can we proceed in reforming prisons. And the other thing is implementing pre-measures to incarceration. And again, where I talk about stigmatization, I would like to really emphasize on normalization. So how do we commit to this? What are the ways can we reintegrate all persons deprived of their liberty back into society? That is a key question. You don't want, say for example, offenders to repeat the offenses again, and you don't want the cycle to continue. So there's also a need to re-inform, raise awareness, and also educate not only these persons who are deprived of their liberty, but also the general public. We need to inform them, or educate them on the rights of these people, and also to encourage or to re-educate the persons who are deprived of their liberty to make better decisions, to make better informed decisions. So I think those are the key things that we have to look into. When I mean we, I'm talking about the government.
Yep. Thank you, Uma. Tong, go ahead.
Thank you, Nadine. I think, first of all, building more prison is not going to solve the problem. Hamza is on that path of building more prisons, and I think they are probably, as Izzah pointed out, they're also probably thinking about private prison. We have seen enough trouble in private prisons in US, where eventually you lead to more and more incarceration and not solving the problem of crime, and also problem of rehabilitation. So that I agree. But of course, if you ask me whether we should not have prison, I also won't go there. I won't go that far, because I think they are prison exists for a certain reason, and we do need prison in many cases. So if I were to make decision, I will focus on dealing with drugs, the question of drugs, because that is 60% of prison population, and many of them are actually on very short stints. Some of them are on 3 months, 60 days, 80 days, 90 days, or 120 days. So actually, many of them do not have to go through prison, and there should be more community support, and there should be more community sentencing, so that they can, or whether sentencing or they are treated as a medical problem or treated as a psychological problem. At least we need to deal with that, so that prison can focus on other crime and other prisoners. So that to me, if I were to do it, that is how I will prioritize it. I also agree with Izzah, sentencing council is important, because if you have sentencing council, then the judges eventually will be able to coordinate and to be measured and proportionate. The problem now is that there are people who steal a bottle, steal Milo, mungkin 14 bulan. I mean, that is because the magistrate and other judges do not have somehow a guidance or guideline on how to sentence, and therefore it is not proportionate and it is not coordinated. These are issues that I think we should deal with.
So I'd like to investigate this concept of the sentencing council a bit, because it was raised by all three of you, Nurul, Izzah, Uma, and also Tong. So perhaps you could speak a little bit more to what is a sentencing council, who makes up a sentencing council, and how does it operate within the judiciary, or is it extrajudiciary, or what is the idea of it? Thank you so much. Either one can begin.
I think I'll let YB Tong to explain further.
It is a British idea. It's a UK idea, and they have it. Basically, the judges will sit together and formulate a certain guideline, so that eventually they will be able to coordinate the effect of sentencing among all judges. Because you have judges at all levels, you also have judges dealing with all sorts of cases, but there is no consistency. So you end up having people who steal a can of Milo and ended up with 14 months, and someone else who steal million and only ended up with a fine. So that is something that I think eventually we will need to deal with, apart from having stipulated years of punishment, stipulated punishment. There are still a lot of room for coordination as far as discretion is concerned. So the judges have discretion, but discretion has to be exercised in order to achieve community, or in order to achieve some form of common impact. So because you cannot have eventually you go to a judge, you get 20 years, and then the same crime you go to another judge, you get 10 years. I think that eventually is unfair to the prisoners. But ultimately, it has to be multi-pronged. We have to deal with the question of war on drugs, as I mentioned earlier. War on drugs. How do we see war on drugs? How do we see criminal justice reform? Sentencing council is part of criminal justice reform. How do we actually deal with the questions of poverty and others? It comes together.
I see. Thank you so much for the explanation. Uma, would you like to add anything, or if not, that's okay. Okay, all right. So, okay, yeah, so I understand better the sentencing council. But okay, so you advocate for the existence of prisons, not the abolishing of them altogether. But we also can't deny the fact that issues of incarceration are compounded by inequalities of class and race, as you have all mentioned already, and one's position in both those categories as well as other categories. For example, overrepresentation of Indians was seen in cases of death in custody. So how do you incorporate this into your framing of the solutions? Or like, is this at the parliamentary level? This is a question for Chintang. Is this part of the discourse? If not, why not? Uma, please feel free to also offer your thoughts.
I think, well, Parliament is not necessarily the best structure to deal with all these issues, because people are diluted. I mean, the issues are diluted because you're dealing with so many other issues, and not many people are interested in prison issues over the years. But I am glad that over the last few years, through our collaboration with Azalea, Izzah, and some other MPs, we were able to put it in a way front and center on the question of prison overcrowding. Through COVID, we discussed about prison overcrowding, and therefore bringing the discussions to parliamentary committees, as well as in Parliament. But still, again, in our system, the executive has a very strong role. And because you have a minister who is not interested in these sort of issues, it makes it very difficult. I wish we could have a more open-minded ministers, at least to deal with the questions of prison overcrowding. As you mentioned earlier, you mentioned about inequality. One of the most apparent part of inequality is remand detainees. They are not convicted, but because they do not necessarily have money to pay bail, and because they have no money to pay bail, or they ended up being remanded for a long period of time. So that is in a way a representation of poverty. There may be needs for us to re-look at how and what other ways to actually post bail. So someone should be able to post bail, not necessarily through money, but it can be in other forms and means. Otherwise, I mean, out of the 60 over 1,000 prisoners on a daily basis, 20 over 1,000 are actually remand prisoners. That means some of them, if they can post bail, they may not necessarily have to end up there. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Chintang. Uma, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think when we're talking about inequality here, it's very hard to really tackle this issue, because we really need to understand as to like why it happens in the first place. So it goes back to my point earlier on, like where I mentioned we need to really understand what the root cause is. Like, is there, for example, why do they resort to committing offenses in the first place? So there is a need to deep dive into that and really understand why does it happen in the first place, or why it happens as such.
Thank you so much. All right, so already in our discussion, we have mentioned how particular classes of offenses bring people into the systems of detention more than others. And what you brought up, Chintang, was drug offenses. I would also like to zero in on immigration offenses, because everybody in the detention centers for immigration detention centers are in there for supposed immigration offenses. And this, just to have a shared idea of who we're talking about people including elderly and also babies, and also stateless people who were born in Malaysia to non-citizens. They are also captured and detained in the immigration detention centers. So what are your thoughts regarding prison as a response to violation of immigration law when this violation is administrative in nature, rather than them actually conducting like a harmful crime? Thank you.
I think there are two parts to it. One is immigration detention. And the other part, you are saying that those who been charged under Immigration Act for immigration offences. I think we are talking about two parts. To me, basically, many of those who are detained under immigration in the immigration center shouldn't have been there. For instance, at the end of the Pakatan government in December, well, just before we fell, Wan Azizah, as Deputy Prime Minister, chaired a meeting, chair a subcommittee meeting of National Security Council to deal with the questions of to consider issuing work permit to the Rohingya refugees who are here. Now, we understand that there is this fear within the establishment that if we accept or if we grant refugee status to refugees here, more will come. Okay, there is this fear within the establishment that we must not allow this to happen. But at the same time, we have at least 170,000 Rohingyas in Malaysia, and we know very clearly that they have nowhere to turn to. They cannot go back to Myanmar, and even to go back to Bangladesh at Cox's Bazar is almost impossible once they leave the place. Of course, you do not want to encourage a huge group coming, but that has to be managed in Cox's Bazar. It has to be managed in Myanmar. If Myanmar continues to be in such a situation now, run under the junta, there are bound to be more and more people leaving Myanmar. And once they leave Myanmar, sometimes if they end up in our neighboring states, eventually even the neighboring states were trying to push them to Malaysia, and they want to come to Malaysia because they have relative here, and they know that as long as they can get through, they may survive here because there are job opportunities. Now, we also now enter into a labor crunch. So in December 2019, what we were hoping is to have a halfway house. The halfway house is work permit. That means they are here. We don't necessarily recognize their refugee status. We don't necessarily grant them any other rights apart from the rights to work for now. At least it's a halfway house for us to meet in the middle. But unfortunately, the government fell, Pakatan fell, and then after that, the subsequent government took a very xenophobic approach from around April 2020 at the height of COVID. So it's very sad, and personally, I felt very bad. I felt we should have actually done better. Now, there are another category where, for example, people will hire illegal workers, foreign workers, and if they are illegals who work here, they can be sentenced to a period of time in jail. My view is that even that we should be rethinking. See, the main problem is not so much of the illegals working here. If you want to deal with the illegals, eventually you have to deal with trafficker. It's the trafficker that enable all this to happen. Now, if the traffickers are not enabling this business, then these people would not be here. They don't come here voluntarily. Many people borrow a lot to come here, and then of course they end up sometimes some of them being whipped. And you just feel that we could have done this in a better way. We could have done this in a better way, but that will require us to rethink the way we run the economy. It's a larger topic. It's a much larger topic. We are now having a situation where Malaysians are working as cheap labor in Singapore, working as cheap labor, picking fruits in Australia, working as cheap labor in South Korea, and also there are Malaysians who now being smuggled to work as illegal workers in Cambodia.
Yes.
I mean, that to a large extent is a reflection of our economy not able to pay many people, many Malaysians, their expected income, expected pay. So you have graduates picking fruits in Australia illegally because they feel that work here doesn't pay a salary, a decent pay that commensurate with what they hope to have, and also how they could what they needed to live. So we need to deal with that. Once we deal with that, we will need to actually upgrade our technology. We need to upgrade our skill. We need to automate. And once you do that, your dependence on cheap labor will lower. If we are a more efficient economy, if we are actually using a lot more technology, using a lot more skilled labor rather than unskilled labor, then the requirement, the needs for hiring unskilled labor will lower. Therefore, you deprive them a market. There is no need to smuggle illegals to come in to be unskilled labor. You want to hire skilled labor, you don't want to hire unskilled labor as across the economy. And if you want to hire skilled labor, if there's a foreigner who wants to come in to work as a skilled labor, then there should be ways to hire them, and we don't need to go through this. So unfortunately, all this debate did not happen, and we are stuck here because we are dependent on very old concept, very old ideas. Government tries to be macho and tries to say, oh, I defend law and order, I defend the sovereignty of the nation, I defend our borders, but we don't actually deal with corruptions in the entire human trafficking structure. So much as we have all these laws, much as we have so many children, I remember reading a report, a PAC report, Public Accounts Committee report about a year and a half ago. We have about 400 over children in immigration detention facilities. Despite all this suffering and all these people, whether they went through the prison or whether they are detained in immigration centers, despite all this, we are still tier 3 in the US State Department trafficking report. Why? Because we do not deal with the root causes. The root causes is there is a demand, and there are cartel, there are traffickers, and there are corruption. We refuse to deal with those symptoms, and eventually it is the poorest, it is those at the bottom of the food chain, it is those people who have to migrate, who have to be illegal migrants, or who have to come all the way as refugee. They suffer, and that is unfortunate.
I agree with you very much, but Chin Tong, allow me to correct your terminology. Rather than illegal worker or illegal migrant, undocumented worker is much more accurate for these people.
No problem. Sure.
Okay. All right, Umavathni, please, your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I don't think, at least if we're talking about those in immigration detention centers, I don't think incarceration is the way forward. And I think there's this gap of understanding in terms of the law, where those who are in immigration detention centers, or those who have been charged under the Immigration Act, they don't have a definitive period as to how long they can be in this immigration detention center. So that's already a question that we need to ask. Like, you can put them as long as you want, regardless of, if there's any initiatives being done in terms of like repatriating them back somewhere to wherever they want to go to. That is a question that we need to ask. I think in the last based on the report that we did, we were informed that UNHCR did not have access to this immigration detention centers since August 2019. And that is before the COVID happened. And we also heard, at least from our multi-stakeholder consultation, we were informed that there are individuals who are still in this immigration detention centers since COVID happened, which is more than 2 years now. So it's very hard for us to access this data. And it's also, it requires different stakeholders' cooperation. You need to, if you don't allow UNHCR to go in, then how are you going to identify who are refugees, and how are you going to provide them with the right identifications and whatnot? So with that absence, you can't move forward. So I think that is so much of a concern here. And also another thing that we need to take note is Malaysia being a party to the CRC, the Convention on Rights of Children, and then the CEDAW, elimination of discrimination against women, and also CRPD, which is on persons with disabilities. So with Malaysia being a party to this, Malaysia should be doing better in terms of protecting the rights of the children, at least, regardless whether they are documented or they are undocumented. We have the obligation to respect and protect the rights of these children. So I think sometime in November, the the Home Ministry stated in a parliamentary written reply that the government is developing a pilot ATD program, Alternatives to Detention, especially for undocumented children. So the thing is, there's no updates regarding this. So it's like, you know, we don't know. There is this thing where you've already made it public, but the thing is, there's no initiatives being done to this. So where do we go about with this? So yeah.
Definitely, definitely. It's a shame that we are party to the CRC, the Convention of the Rights of the Child, and yet we have children in our detention centers, sometimes even in our prisons. In fact, it's for some people, the mere act of being born is what brings them into detention centers, because if they were born to non-citizens, is this the Malaysia that we want? Is this this is the Malaysia that we have inherited? And for my peers in Dewan Muda Malaysia, and also my peers watching through the Facebook Live, I think that we should really consider whether this should be the Malaysia we would like to reproduce. And regarding the idea of the in terms of the people who are within immigration detention centers, I would also like to raise the point that a lot of the people who are convicted for immigration offenses through the court system are not necessary. In fact, I would contend that it is the majority of them. In my line of work, we see that this, we observe that this is the case, because a lot of them are put in detention centers for being undocumented without sufficient investigation to the factors that made them so. Because through immigration law, it's actually the employer's responsibility for maintaining a worker's visa. And yet the people who bring, as you said, the traffickers often get off scot-free, and the people who are put into the detention centers are these workers who come from more vulnerable backgrounds, and these are the people who populate our immigration centers. A lot of them are not at fault. In addition to that, we have very weak platforms for redress, even in cases where we do detect abuse of the system by employers, for example. And that is why, unfortunately, we are still at tier 3 of the Trafficking in Persons report, which is published by the US every year, just for the information of my fellow viewers and listeners. Because even when a trafficking case, which includes forced labor, there are many cases. In my line of work, I manage cases, and it's normal for me now to have a case of a domestic worker, for example, who has been unpaid for 12 years, 10 years, 8, 9 years, and these cases are still very difficult to be prosecuted under the Atipsum Act, the Trafficking in Persons Act. And these people, unfortunately, there's a pipeline between being exposed to the criminal justice system and being put into detention. So in terms of getting justice for them, there's a lot of risk analysis that we have to do, and we're very afraid that they go into detention, because there are very, very poor reports of what detention is like. All right, so before we go on to the questions from the floor, I think I would like to take advantage of the fact that we have a parliamentarian here, and also recognizing that this forum is for Dewan Muda, so trying to understand the systems of parliament in particular. So Tong, you are the deputy chairman, if I'm not mistaken, of the APPGM for reforms in all places of detention. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about that. Why was such a platform necessary, and also what have its successes been? And if you could also let us know, and Umavathni, it would be great if you can also chime into what your views are on this. In what are the challenges that still remain? I think you already touched on it earlier a little bit, political will, for example, but perhaps you can elaborate on that. So yeah, so APPGM successes, challenges. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Nadine. First of all, I must clarify that I'm not a member of parliament at the moment. I was first elected as member of parliament for Bukit Bendera in 2008, and then I moved to Kluang as MP for Kluang in 2013. I lost to Wikasiong in Aitam when I challenged him in 2018, and I was subsequently appointed as a senator, which is the upper house of parliament. And also at the time, in 2018, I was deputy defense minister. But with the change of government, my senatorship lasts for 3 years. you can be reappointed once for another 3 years in your whole life. That means if you are senator, you can serve a maximum of 6 years, 2 terms, 6 years. So I was not reappointed because it was a different government after 2020. And in this year, in March this year, I was elected as a state assemblyman in Johor. So I'm currently state assemblyman and also a Johor state opposition leader.
Thank you for the clarification. My apologies.
Yeah, no, but it's okay. It's okay because we are still involved in APPGM. APPGM is somehow a body that we created within the parliament structure, but it's recognized by the Speaker of Parliament. But it is just a structure for MPs to deal with a specific issue. It has no legal standing, but it is within the Parliament framework so that MPs can gather and meet on specific issues. And this particular issue is on prison and detention centers. There is another APPGM on sustainability, and there's one on refugee. So there are several of them. And part of the reason why this is needed, APPGM is needed, is because our former structure in our parliament is still very archaic. Our parliamentary structure is still very much executive dominated. That means the government, the executive, the cabinet dominated the agenda of parliament. It is MPs basically is subjected to the whim and fancy of the executive. Now, under Pakatan government, there were a bit of loosening. There are some parliamentary committees being formed. Ideally, every ministry should be supervised by a committee. So a committee, a permanent committee in the parliament may be able to, let's say, supervise 2 or 3 ministries, and this committee should sit down to understand the issues in that 2 or 3 ministries in the long run. That means this is to help MPs to build expertise. But unfortunately, in our system, it is still in infancy. So we do have some committees, some are better performed than other committees. For instance, the health committee is very active. The health committee in parliament is very, very active. But there are certain ministries which are not supervised by any committee. And basically, once you don't have committees, parliament is just a talk shop. You go to the chamber, and anywhere in the world, including the US Senate or US House of Rep or the British Parliament, when you go to the chamber to a certain extent is a theater. So to a certain extent, you go to the chamber, there are elements of critical performances. And in our system, you are opposition, your government. Once you go to the chamber, once you go to the main chamber, it is adversarial. And very often, anywhere in the world, once you go into the chamber, it is critical. It is adversarial. So it is a bit difficult to do long-term business in the chamber. You need to have committees. You need to have committees so that MPs in that committee build long-term memory and also understanding of policies, which is why I've been advocating for parliamentary reform all this time, since my first entry into parliament in 2008. I think parliamentary reform is fundamental to the nation. At this moment, the AG chamber takes these views that all bills have to be drafted by AG chamber, and the government is still holding this view that, let's say tomorrow they want to pass the bill, they will give you just 2 or 3 days before they pass the bill. It has become a habit that no one should see the bill. The bill is not going to see the light until 2 or 3 days before they want to pass it, and they want to parachute it into the chamber, so that you have only 2 or 3 days scramble for a response, and then eventually the newspaper only cover parliamentary news on what Bung Mokhtar or what Tajudin say. So parliament to the public is just a place for quarrel, but it is not. Actually, parliament sits from 10 a.m. in the morning, sometimes until 7 p.m., sometimes until 8 p.m., sometimes until 9 p.m. It is supposed to be a place for serious business, yet the press is not interested. Therefore, the public is also not aware of what is the role of parliament. And because we do not have committee system, so it makes it very difficult for MPs to gain expertise and to build on policy expertise. We also don't have a structure where the government will support or the parliament will support opposition MPs through researchers and also through an opposition front bench. That means a shadow cabinet. Say in Australia, shadow cabinet ministers are paid. They are paid an extra allowance. They also get an extra staff. In UK, the opposition leader gets extra staff in order to do work for the shadow cabinet. But here we don't have. Not only we don't actually, individual MPs are not provided for with researchers. So we have 12 or 15 people in parliament to do research, but you don't have individual researcher attached to MPs. That is also another challenge that we are facing. So people like myself and I think Izzah as well, we have to raise funds to hire our own researchers. Some of us do have researchers, but that is at the expense of a lot of time to raise funds in order to support a decent small team, 2 or 3 people to work on policies. And because we don't have that policy environment, so ministers are making policy not based on evidence, not based on facts. They are making policy based on their gut feeling, their intuition. And very, very often, sometimes a minister or even prime minister make policy at press conferences. When press asks them questions, they give a simple reply, and that replies become policies, and then eventually the civil servant have to scramble to suit that particular statement that is made by the ministers. So we are in that sort of state that I hope we can change. And as I like what Nadine said earlier, I hope this generation, we are talking to very young people. You are 20 years, 30 years younger than me. I hope by the time that you reach my age, I'm 45, in 20 years time, you will see a very different Malaysia that you can be proud of. The way we handle trafficking, the way we handle Rohingya, the way we handle what they call migrant workers, sometimes you just feel that it's a shame. We just don't feel proud. We don't stand tall internationally. When during my time as deputy minister under the Pakatan government, I did feel that at least we are contributing positively to the Rohingya issue. We are trying to manage the Rohingya issue internationally. At least you feel that we can do something. We can stand tall internationally. Just like what Izzah said, in the 90s, Malaysia was involved and at the forefront. Mahathir and Anwar were at the forefront championing the causes of the Bosnian during the war. And we stand tall internationally, but now we don't stand tall. And I hope in the years to come, your generation can build a Malaysia that is kinder, but actually better, and also help us to stand tall internationally. Thank you.
Uma, in the interest of time, rather than continue on from that question, can I pose another question that came from the floor? All right, so I have a question from our participants. Definitely the discussion about detention, incarceration, prisons cannot be divorced from the enforcement that put them there in the first place. So this question is, should the police force be reformed or abolished as well? What are your thoughts? Uma.
I think just like the question of like, should prisons be abolished altogether? I don't think that police should be abolished, or like should I think at least there needs to be reforms, and also standard, I guess a more standardized operating procedure within the police force. So like, I guess like, I think at least from my experience, being a caseworker for this is totally a separate issue, but it still involves the police, is that when I was managing a case for an SGBV survivor, you notice that in different police stations, different police officers have their own understanding of, you know, how they want to manage these cases. So I think there needs to be sort of like a a mutual understanding across the police force on like what is it that they need to do to be more consistent, if that answers the question.
If you don't mind, Nadine, can I say something about police reform?
Yes.
I hope I'm not too long-winded, but I would like all of you, if you have a chance, go to Google this document called Tun Zaidin Report, the 2005 report on police reform. It's about 600 pages, and I urge you to read it. The problem in 2003, when Abdullah Badawi became prime minister, one of the first things he did was to set up a royal commission to look into police reform, and the report was produced or presented in May 2005, which is 17 years ago, and that is perhaps the best ever report produced about the police force. Fundamentally, why we're having a problem with the police is that in 1948, this a bit. I hope I'm not too long-winded, but I just want to give you a bit of background.
It's okay. I love history.
In 1948, when the British decided to fight against the communists, they decided not to form a Malayan armed forces, but actually they expanded the police force, centralized the police force, and expanded the police force by 7-fold within 2 years. So by 1950, the police force was 7-fold bigger than the original 1948 police force. And the police force became a centralized force, and they were focusing on anti-communist activities. So the police force took on a semi-military, paramilitary, what they call the thinking, and the police force think of itself as a force and not a service. Now, in many countries, policing is actually the role of the city or the state government or provincial government. But in Malaysia, police is a centralized function, and police see themselves as a competitor to the armed forces. They see themselves as almost like the armed forces. Now, within the police force, there are many what they call legacy entities. For instance, we have this big organization called General Operation Force. At least about 15,000 police out of the 120,000 are actually under GOF. What is GOF? GOF was previously called Police Field Force. They were in the jungle fighting the communists. But today they are dealing with securing the border. And GOF may not necessarily need to exist anymore because there's no more communists, and we may need to move towards a separate border force. So we may not need GOF. And then the other example is during the communist time, Special Branch played a very important role. So Special Branch was to basically intelligence unit, but now Special Branch is being used against the political rivals of the government. Sometimes also used to spy on politicians within the government, within the governing party. But today, actually, you don't need the Special Branch to do political work. You want more investigation officer. You want more IOs. Now we have a relatively small criminal investigation department out of the 120,000 police force. Less than 10,000 people are in CID. And only probably less than about 3,000 people. I don't have the most updated figure, but most likely less than 3,000 people who are IOs. That means IOs that can sign investigation paper. Less than 3,000 of them. Now, what is the consequence of that? In urban areas, some IO has to investigate 30 to 40 cases a month. The ideal situation is an IO investigate maybe 4 or 5 cases a month, so that they can actually spend enough time on each cases. But in our case, the IO has no time. And so when the case comes to them, they will try to do administrative, what they call investigation. They will check how are you. They will ask you all sorts of questions. But after that, they may not have time to really investigate. So then some IO investigate, or if they get someone push them, whether some politician call them, you must investigate this case. So they will investigate. Maybe some people bribe them, so they investigate. Maybe sometimes because out of passion, compassionate, they want to investigate. But they don't have enough time to investigate, and they do not have enough tools to investigate. So if you watch TV series, you have all sorts of what they call scientific methods to investigate. We are very lacking in those things. We are lacking in those things. Our IOs have no time to investigate. We don't have enough IOs. So those issues have not been dealt with. When we talk about police reform, of course, many of our friends in the NGOs, they want IPCMC. I have no problem with that. I also think IPCMC is good. But to me, that is not be it and all. I hope the younger generation will spend some time together with champion a new police force, a police force that is actually distributing their human resources in more contemporary ways to meet the contemporary needs, rather than going back to old time and not prepared to change it. But these are nitty-gritties, these are details where we don't talk about. But I do hope that friends in the NGOs, the younger generations, look at policy in a holistic manner. Thank you.
Thank you. The figures that you just cited are very shocking. 3,000 IOs out of the 120,000 police force. That is kind of crazy. Yeah, that's actually very insightful. And I think in addition to the current discourse that we hear, in addition to the IPCMC, in addition to investigating officers, I would also probably consider the capacity of the prosecution, perhaps the DPPs, because they also play a role in making sure cases are prosecuted. But yeah, those are further questions to consider. What are the structural problems that are causing a lot of the cases to fail or be investigated or treated in a slipshod manner that might bring people into the detention or prison systems. Thank you so much, Uma and Tong, for that. So I think I'll also, we have 5 minutes left. I'll pose another question from the participants. I'm so sorry to everybody. We don't have time to address every single question, but I'll ask this one. So how likely do you think we can actually dismantle the current model and replace it with a transformative model, given the capitalism and racism in this country? I think this ties into some of the things that you touched on earlier, Tong, but also Uma as well. Either of you can take the floor to answer first.
I have a very short answer on this. First of all, we must know what we want to change. So I won't go in to say that I want to change capitalism without knowing what to change, which is why I think knowledge is important, policy details is important. Let's say we want to change a police force, we want to double the number of IOs, we want to reduce the number of special branch officers by half. So at least we need to be able to know what we want, have the details, and then that's where we can start the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Uma?
Yeah, I think it's possible for us to get there, but it's not going to be very soon. It requires a lot of political will. It requires a lot of evidence-based research. So all those things have to be taken into account in order for us to reach that step. But I think slowly we are moving towards that, but it's going to take some time.
If I may add, insofar as we're talking about profit accumulation, I would say that the efforts to reform, maybe even trafficking laws, detention, etc., are motivated by that sometimes, as can be seen by responses after maybe we were banned by EU or the US for various of our industries. Therefore, we have economic loss. Yeah, questions of economy and racism are definitely very relevant in this discussion. So you answered much faster than I anticipated. So I'll ask another question.
Okay, I mean, to give you a broader view, I would say that in the long run, Malaysia should see itself creating a diamond-shaped society. At the moment, our society is a triangle society. The bottom is huge. There are many people at the bottom, but we must have what they call the political will to create an economic structure where there will be a huge middle class. There'll be a huge middle class. People in the middle are bigger. We cannot abolish the bottom, otherwise everyone will end up in the bottom, a new bottom. But the point is that we should lift many more people to through paying people better, But by paying people better, we will need to upgrade technology. We need to reduce dependence on labor, but automate based on skill and all this, which we are capable of. And I think it is just because there are so many vested interests, and the government is not prepared to think beyond what they see in front of them, and people who are outside, people who are in the opposition, have not spent enough time thinking of an alternative. We don't agree on alternative, and the opposition in many ways still live in the era of opposing and not get the message that we have to be the alternative. We have to advocate alternative, and if we advocate alternative, we need to be able to present something that is better. That conversation eventually, I think, will come, and the demand by the public, the expectation of the public is that the opposition is not just opposing, but actually be prepared to be alternative government. And of course, to everyone who wants a better Malaysia, I urge you that we need to build the knowledge and discussions so that we can offer real alternative.
Thank you so much. I would also like to possibly center also the other aspect of that question, which was racism. And I would actually implore the APPGM to be consciously anti-racist in terms of its efforts to reform prisons and all places of detention, especially as we know, the rhetoric itself that we use to describe people who are in detention, for example, a lot of foreigners, is highly dehumanizing. For example, the term pati, without understanding the reasons that go behind their immigration status, and also the reality that there are a lot of minority groups who are overrepresented in the detention and prison systems. So thank you so much to the person who asked that question. And in order to address that, just like Nurul, Izzah mentioned, and all of you have mentioned, we need to know the numbers of who is in prison in terms of the race representation of the prisoners and detainees. So definitely data is something that we support that call. But to end...
Basically, one third of the prisoners are foreigners. In a normal, one third of the, around 21,000 are foreigners.
In the prisons, not
the
detention center.
Yeah, in the prison.
I see. Okay, thank you so much for contributing that statistic. Regarding statistics, also, I wanted to ask, so a lot of your Swaram report, Uma, called for a higher transparency of data, etc. I just wanted to find out if you could give insight, perhaps Tong, how can't these questions be asked in Parliament and then the data will have to be given, or is there something I'm not understanding here?
Yeah, you can ask through MPs. If you want data, you can ask through MPs. Very often they will reply. Sometimes they don't reply incomplete or don't meet your full expectation. But I've been asking, when I was member of parliament, I've been asking all sorts of questions. I have details about how many people will hang, how many people on death row, as well as the number of prisoners. But overall, actually today, if you visit the prison website, some of the data are there as well. And if you follow some of our writings, some of this data are there. You don't get the full picture, but you actually know roughly the broad parameters. For example, around 1/3 of prisoners are actually foreigners. I think that is common knowledge to many people who are in the circle.
Uma, do you think that more parliamentary questions is part of the solution in terms of as far as data goes, or what are your additional thoughts?
I think that it's more of something that could complement existing data, but I think what we need is transparency from the government. That's essentially it, and we need official data and not just wait for someone to actually give a parliamentarian to actually pose that question, and then only we can get the answer. So data should already be easily accessible by the public in order to ensure there's accountability and transparency. Again, I reiterate that. And I think the good thing is that we actually do have, I mentioned this in the report, the Malaysian Public Sector Open Data Portal. So the thing about this portal is that the public could actually request for data, and it depends on the relevant agencies or ministries to provide this data if they have it available. But the thing is, what we encountered with this was, say for example, if I'm looking for something on statistics on prison, if I search it in English, I will get the data only in English. So I have to also look at it in Malay to find other data related to the prison department also. So there is that, and it's not consistent. And you know, like for example, when they did provide data, for example, I think breakdown on number of prisoners in Malaysia, they gave a set and like an Excel sheet that sort of puts what are the numbers of prisoners in different prisons in the state, according to state, and also by gender. And the gender is only men and women, that's it. And the thing is that the gap here is that even though we know what is the number for each of the state, the thing is we don't know, you know, like how many of them actually went in and I guess how many of them went out along the way, like went out of prison. So that number doesn't reflect in that data. So what we see, say for example, right, in the year 2016, what we've identified is the total is 120,797, which is huge. So we don't know as to like, okay, out of this 120,000, how many of them actually remain throughout that whole year. And, you know, probably that number is carried forward to the next year. So again, there's that discrepancy, you know, on what is the true figure for as to how many prisoners are across Malaysia. So yeah, and another thing is also because we still don't have freedom of right to information legislation, which actually gives the public the power to request for information. So even if we have this open data portal, and if you see there is a disclaimer saying that Malaysia practices this, where, you know, they give data if you request for it, it's not by obligation, if you get what I mean. Without the right to information, if say it's not an obligation for the government to provide you data on that. So if you have a right to information, it gives the power to the public to actually request for this data, or that it should be made available. So I think those are the two things that I just wanted to say about in regards to this. Nadine, you're muted.
Thank you. Perhaps that could also be part of the answer to one of the questions that unfortunately we don't have time to address, but regarding, there was someone who was wondering why the government does not allow, for example, UNHCR to access detention centers. Perhaps if we had those mechanisms that you described, Uma, we would be able to get an answer currently that we don't have. All right, so let's conclude. Perhaps Chintong and Uma, if you could provide your concluding remarks, and then if we can all take a photo of everybody in this Zoom meeting.
Yeah, just to conclude, I hope we can together work towards a kinder state, and a kinder state hopefully will be a better state for all, and a better state that we can all be proud of. Thank you.
Yeah, at least for me, I think that we Malaysians or anyone are empathetic in nature, and I guess we have the responsibility and the duty to respect and also uphold human rights of other people, and let us not forget that, you know, regardless of whoever it is, they are still human beings.
For me, thank you so much, both of you. Yes, people are suffering right now, and hundreds of people have already died within the prison and detention centers. And this conversation, the discussion that we're having right now, it's gone on, it's been at the same point more or less for the past 30 years. So I really hope that we can achieve success do the solutions that we've discussed in this panel, this forum, within my lifetime. I really hope. All right, so thank you so much, YB Liew Chintong and also Umavathni. Thank you so much for all of your insights. I think we all have truly learned a lot. And thank you everybody who's attending through the Zoom meeting and also the FB Live. Thank you so much. I'm Nadine Faisal and I've been your host. All right, so perhaps